Okay, so welcome to our Horse Ownership 101 homesteading series. Tonight we are going to have, we're going to be hearing from Crystal Smith. She's a professor at WVU in the Davis College of Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Design. She also leads the Equine Studies minor and manages the horse unit at the J.W. Ruby Research Farm in Reedsville. So before we get started, I just wanted to take a couple minutes and let you know about some of the resources that we have in the Business Development Division. This is the West Virginia Grown Marketing Program that is free for all producers around the state. And as a member, you can use the logo for branding on displays and even labels like on meat. And some of the other bonuses include that your information is on the department's website. It goes in the market bulletin and in the West Virginia Grown directory, which there's an example here on that slide. Another program that's housed in the Business Development Division is the Veterans and Heroes to Ag program, and it supports veterans and heroes getting into agriculture through education, scholarships, mentorship opportunities, technical and business development support, and then navigating the available resources. And this is another resource with our business development division. My name is Ashley Amos. I'm one of the planning coordinators here, and as you can see, we have 4 different ones around the state. And if you're not in one of those highlighted counties, then we all kind of just conquer and divide that region. And just wanted to put as a reminder about our next homesteading webinar. So Crystal, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, let me screen share and then just make sure, Ash, that this is coming up. Can you guys see my screen share?
Yep.
Okay, so Ashley, if you don't mind, I'm going to have you monitor the chat and just stop me if there's any questions that come up, you guys. I'm also leaving plenty of time for questions at the end, so I'm happy to answer anything that you have. So Horse Ownership 101, I wanted to focus mostly on the basic responsibilities and kind of the additional responsibilities of horse ownership. It's definitely a big task. It's not something that we recommend people enter into lightly because, you know, they are big animals, they're a livestock species, they require a lot of space, food, shelter, and care. And so the responsibilities of ownership are fairly large, and they can oftentimes be costly as well. So it's something that you just want to make sure that you're not entering into lightly, and you can meet all of those needs very well. So I'm going to talk to you guys tonight about the basic responsibilities of horse ownership. So things like what is required in terms of shelter, food, and water. And then I'll go into some of the care responsibilities related to the health and the maintenance of the animal as well. So let's start with adequate shelter. Adequate shelter can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, but in its most basic form, you're just providing that animal with protection from the elements. So a horse that's in really great body condition, in a normal health status, can do a really great job of, you know, heating and cooling themselves and maintaining body condition as long as they're protected from elements like wind, wet weather, and ice. And if they have adequate access to forage and water, they'll do an even better job. So we're trying to provide them with some sort of protection from the elements. That doesn't have to be, you know, a center aisle barn with 12 by 12 stalls. It could be something more similar. It could be, you know, a stabled horse. It could be horses that have access to a 3-sided run-in shed. And there are some horses that do really well with just a really great wind block in their pasture to protect them from those elements. And I'll talk a little bit about these in more detail. But the other thing I want you to be thinking about is access to turnout. So access to turnout for horses is super important. And there's a lot of different ways to get this done. So we could have horses that are turned out on pasture all or for a portion of their day. We could have horses that are turned out in a small paddock, which would just be a smaller space enclosure with grass, access to forage, those sort of things. Again, for all or a portion of their day. Or they could be on a dry lot or a sacrifice lot. You'll sometimes hear me use those terms interchangeably. And those are usually for horses that have really specific health statuses. And so we'll, make those choices on a case-by-case basis. So there's no one perfect shelter. It definitely becomes a decision based on what's best for that horse, what's best for that management scenario, and maybe what's feasible and available to that farm owner or that horse owner. So stalls or stabled horses, again, there's really high costs associated with labor and just cost of construction. But the advantage of a stall kept horse is it allows you to provide for really individualized care. So we can feed them like an individual, groom them like an individual, etc. Run-ins are going to be lower in labor and cost. So much lower cost to build, much lower cost to maintain, and less laborious. But you want to build them in a way that's really well draining. The advantage of your run-in sheds, by and large, is that it allows that horse to have access to their natural environment. So they can come and go as they please. They can see their natural environment from their shelter and not live, a life of total confinement. And then a windbreak, again, no cost, no labor, very minimal inputs, but that might not be sufficient in cold weather climates like where we live or in all conditions. So again, allows them that access to that natural environment, but maybe won't be enough to kind of serve the needs of the horses in, a cold weather 4-season environment. So you start making these decisions, again, based on the horses in your care, based on the area that you live, based on the labor and the construction and the maintenance costs that you're willing to bear. And then we also usually make these decisions based on what our needs are. So a lot of times, a horse that's kept in a stall is kept in a stall for training purposes. So we want access to those horses. We can pull them out of their stalls, tack them up, ride, train, and then also give them access to pasture. So it, again, becomes a little bit of an individualized decision on that. Next thing would be food and water. So food and water and nutrition programs for horses could be a talk in and of itself. I can definitely answer questions about this in more details at the end, but just in its most basic form, if we're talking about a horse that is cared for, that horse will have some sort of access to forage. So that would be whatever that horse could consume out in the pasture. So green, fresh, growing grasses and legumes, or hay, dried, preserved grasses and legumes. And ideally, it has access to pasture that's appropriate for the nutrient requirements of that horse and the specific health conditions it has. There are some horses where we actually have to limit feed, so they can't be left to their devices, turned out on great, really productive pasture 24/7, and they would actually be at a health detriment if they were given that much access to forage. So again, becomes a little bit complicated, but access to appropriate forage for their nutrient requirements would be key. Then we basically would supplement with some sort of concentrate. So concentrate would be grain that's formulated to meet the nutrient requirements and the health conditions of that horse. And then they also should have access to clean, fresh water at all times. And I'll break down some of the costs of these items for you guys as we move forward as well. Okay, other responsibilities. So the basic stuff, again, shelter, food, and water. Your other responsibilities are going to be pretty large in size and scope, just as important to the health and the welfare of that animal. So definitely not things to be skipped on or skimped on in any way. So some of the things that I think are responsibilities of good horse owners that are worth talking about are all of the things related to preventative care. So, just like a livestock, like a traditional livestock, like cattle gets preventative care, annual exams, vaccines, things like that to maintain health status. Horses do as well. Emergency care, so at least having a budget for an emergency care and kind of an expectation of what you should be prepared for would be important. Farrier care, or the hoof care of that horse, is critical and can be really challenging to find an appropriate farrier. Use and marketability are things that people don't often think about. So I want to touch on that for you tonight. Use and marketability, I want you thinking down the line of, how am I ensuring that this horse is useful, not only to me, but to somebody else in the future. So if my circumstances change and I can't continue to care for this horse, or something's changed in my life, would he be useful and appropriate for somebody else that they would want to take him on? And I apologize, I always use he when I'm talking about horses because I prefer geldings. So it's just a habit of mine, but mares are great too. And then the last thing I want you guys talking about is end of life decisions. So, if we're taking this animal on as a lifetime commitment, or as close to a lifetime commitment as we can handle, what are your plans for that horse for the end of life? Are you thinking about those things? Are you planning for those things? And are you budgeting for them? Okay, so preventative care for horses is pretty broad. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. It can be fairly costly to maintain that horse from a preventative care standpoint. So things that would be included in your preventative care plan would be an annual exam for that horse. Annual exams are really important. It's a time for you to develop a relationship with a vet that knows your horse, is willing to discuss with you and investigate any sort of changes in health status that horse has had over the last year. And then also, if you're patronizing that veterinarian's clinic for annual exams and your Coggins test and your vaccinations and all of those things, then you'll establish a good vet client patient relationship with that person, and they'll be more likely to come see you or service your animals in an emergency. So annual exams are really important. We typically will do an annual exam on a horse in the spring. So right now is a perfect time to be doing annual exams. Veterinarians are really busy right now with that. And your annual exam will include a complete physical exam of the horse. So part of which is being done here in this picture. So we'll do a complete physical exam. We'll look at that horse's normals. We'll look at his temperature, pulse, and respiration, his hydration levels. We'll look and see if he's symmetrical. Has his gait changed? Are his eyes normal? All of the things. It's a really thorough health exam to just get a sense of what the status of that horse is. So we'll do our annual exam, and then we'll typically pull a Coggins on that horse. So your Coggins test is testing for equine infectious anemia. It's a highly transmissible equine disease. We've done a really good job of controlling and almost eradicating for it because we do these annual Coggins tests. So the veterinarian would pull blood on that horse, send it off for a Coggins test. Your Coggins is also what will allow that horse to travel. So if you plan to go on trail rides or go to clinics or show that animal, proof of negative Coggins test is always required. Vaccinations are going to be specifically tailored to that horse, and it'll be based on that horse's age, his location, and his use and amount of travel. So use and travel is also important in addition to the location where he lives, because you're not only vaccinating to prevent against diseases that happen in the area where you live, but you're preventing for diseases that are happening to the areas where this horse is going to travel to. So if it's a companion horse, a backyard horse, maybe a trail horse that doesn't leave the property very often, and you just ride out from your own property, your vaccination profile, might be a little bit tighter. If it's a horse that's traveling to horse shows across the country, he's going to have a much broader vaccination profile. So typically you would vaccinate 1 to 2 times a year. So typically spring and fall, and then there's some things that we booster for, depending on, again, the prevalence of that disease process in the area. And that would be just specifically formulated by your veterinarian on that horse's age, location, and his use and travel. Parasite control programs as well are something that we recommend that you would develop with your veterinarian. So the research on parasite control programs has come a long way in the past, even the past 5 years, we know a lot more about how to manage parasites well than we did, 10, 20 years ago. So what we would typically do is pull a fecal egg count or a fecal egg test on that horse, analyze his manure, figure out what his parasite burden is or what his parasite load is, and then the veterinarian will come up with a plan for deworming. So there is an initial cost to running that fecal, but then you end up saving money in the long term because we typically are only deworming horses and controlling for parasites 1 to 2 times per year. Sometimes more if they're in a management scenario that's not very well managed for manure or managed for parasites, but most horses are going to be, low to moderate shedders. And so the number of times a year that we would deworm them is much lower than kind of the old school method of deworming them every other month. So parasite control also really important. We're not trying to eradicate the parasites in their environment. We're trying to control them and keep them at a low level. And then the last big thing in terms of preventative care that I think is important for you to be thinking about is dentistry. So horses do require dental care 1 to 2 times per year based on age and then the condition of their dentition. Sometimes more than that. So sometimes you'll have a horse that has really poor dentition, maybe has not received appropriate dental care over, many, many years. And so he has big problems that are going on in his mouth that need to be fixed, but we can only fix them, in really small increments at a time. So 1 to 2 times is kind of your baseline. Usually the general rule of thumb is if the horse is really young or if the horse is really old, we'll do dental exams twice a year. And if the horse is kind of middle-aged, so say 5 to 18, then he might be able to get away with a once-a-year dental exam and care. Okay, so again, just all parts of kind of the routine preventative care for that horse. Emergency care. I think emergency care is also really important. It's one of the things that people often don't account for. And when something goes wrong that can't be treated on farm or requires a lot of supportive care for that horse, the bill can really run up very quickly. So there's a couple things that you can do to ensure that you're prepared for any emergency that kind of happens on your farm, and then that you're budgeting for things that would be, beyond the reach of any horse owner. So it's super important that you're just knowledgeable about basic first aid. It's super important that you have a good vet client patient relationship. So this goes for any animal in your care, whether it's, your small animal clients that you have at your home, your horses in your backyard or in your pasture, or other more traditional livestock species. But good vet client patient relationships are critical. And again, the best way to maintain a good vet client patient relationship is to patronize that practice for annual exams, Coggins tests, vaccinations, dentistry, developing these parasite control problems. If you interact with that veterinarian and that veterinarian knows you, knows your horse, you pay your bills on time, your horse is mannerly when they come to visit, they're going to come out and be committed to taking care of you in case of emergency. Where you will run into problems is if you don't ever utilize a vet clinic for anything, and then a huge emergency happens and you really need veterinary intervention and you're not a regular client of that practice, and the regular clients are always going to take priority. So that's not to say that you can't get serviced or you can't maybe haul them somewhere, but if you really need somebody to come out to your farm, you want to ensure that that relationship is really good. Other things that I think are important for horse owners to know, and these are things that, again, you can be trained to do, even if you're not a seasoned horse owner, you haven't had a lot of horse experience, is how to complete a basic physical exam. So a basic physical exam would include things like temperature, pulse, and respiration. So what's the health status of that horse, just in terms of temperature, pulse, respiration? What those values are will tell the veterinarian a lot about what the status of that emergency is, how painful that horse is, and how critical it is for that horse to come to the clinic and receive immediate care or whether or not it's something that could be handled at home. So temperature, pulse, respiration. Capillary refill time is a test that you can use to assess mucous membranes for dehydration, or you could also do a skin pinch test. You want to be able to know that the status of the mucous membranes is normal. So we like mucous membranes to be moist and pink. So if you pull up the lip of that horse's upper lip and you look at his gums, they should be moist and pink. And then you want to be able to assess whether that horse is bright, alert, and responsive. So does he look bright, alert, and responsive, or does he look depressed, down, and lethargic? What is his status? And all of this stuff is important because these are the things that the veterinarian is going to want to know when you call in that emergency. So there are things that you need to be able to communicate. If you can do a basic physical exam, communicate the status of this horse really clearly to the veterinarian, they'll have a much better picture about what's going on. Again, whether that horse can be cared for at home, whether it's something that needs to be hauled to a clinic immediately. So it just gives them a lot of good information, and I think it's important for you to know. It's also important because if this horse requires veterinary intervention, you need to be able to do these treatments and then provide that aftercare and communicate back to the veterinarian whether everything is progressing the way it's supposed to progress or whether it's taking a nosedive. So again, just important for you to be able to kind of learn to do those things. And then ideally you would be skilled at providing some basic treatments, some aftercare, and then if you can keep really good records and take really good notes on what's going on with that horse, even better. So those are all things that would really make a veterinarian happy to have you as a client. Hi, Ash, how are we on questions? Anything yet?
Not yet.
Okay, so I'll keep going. So farrier care is the next big thing. This is definitely can be a little bit of a big ticket item for you, and it's super important to the health status of that horse. So excuse me, taking care of that horse's hooves, super critical whether you're utilizing that horse. So you're showing that horse, trail riding that horse, using it in any way for a performance standpoint, or whether it's just standing in the pasture, 365 days a year. Either way, it requires good routine farrier care. So farrier care from horses is at a minimum trimming and balancing that hoof in a way that it's going to maintain some health, it's going to grow evenly, it's going to wear evenly, and then you're going to fix any of those imbalances through that trim and balance process. So typically a horse would receive farrier care somewhere in a 4 to 8 week range. That range is going to depend a lot on the horse's age, his use, his plane of nutrition. So what is he eating? How often is he eating fresh growing forage? And then also any specific health conditions that he may have. So all of those things could make the foot grow more, the foot grow slower, the foot wear quicker, the foot wear slower. So those are all things that would be a discussion with that farrier. It is 100% a year-round commitment. So sometimes you'll hear that people will, trim and shoe their horses in the spring and kind of maintain them through the summer and fall. And then when they're not in use in the winter, they might pull shoes, which is fine. But then that horse's farrier care is just kind of forgotten through the winter months. And they absolutely don't stop growing in the winter. They still need to be trimmed and balanced. So I just want you to understand that it's a year-round commitment, whether you're using the horse or not. That hoof is still growing and it's still wearing, and it doesn't always happen at a perfect rate for a variety of reasons. So it's important that that farrier maintains that horse routinely. And then the last thing, which is a huge take-home for you guys, and if you remember nothing else about farrier care, I want you to remember this. You need to find a reputable and a skilled, trained farrier, and that can be extremely difficult. So finding a good farrier, somebody who has a good reputation, comes when he's scheduled to come, is skilled and is trained at assessing hoof balance, doing whatever sort of, barefoot trimming and or shoeing that horse requires for its use. All of those things are super critical, and they are harder to find than you would think. So you want to be really judicious in your search for a good farrier. Okay, that said, you and your horse also need to be really good clients. So good farriers are hard to find. They're even harder to find, or they're harder to keep if your horse is not reputable, if your horse is unskilled, or if your horse is untrained. So what I mean is, if your horse can't stand quiet and mannerly to have his feet handled, trimmed and balanced, or to put shoes on, if that's what he requires, a good farrier is going to walk away from that job. So they don't want to get beat up. They can't afford to be knocked out of commission by a bad, poorly mannered horse. And so definitely the onus is on the owners to make sure that that horse is he's clean, he's being held for the farrier in a way that is safe for the farrier, and that he's going to stand there and be, a mannerly client. So all of those things are super critical. Really good farriers have plenty of people on their roster, and so they'll fire clients that don't present mannerly horses to be shod because they just can't afford it. They can't afford to get hurt doing the job that they need to do. So definitely making sure that your horse is a good citizen for the farrier, I think, is super critical. Okay, and then use and marketability. So this kind of plays along with what I was talking about with the farrier care. So for use and marketability, you need to be committed to having a really well-mannered and a well-trained horse for whatever its desired use is. Okay, and this horse in this picture is obviously a show horse. It doesn't have to be a show horse. It could be a trail horse. It could be a therapeutic riding horse. It could be a companion horse. But whatever the job is that that horse is supposed to be doing, he needs to be well-mannered and trained for that desired purpose. He also needs to be really sound, really sane, and really well cared for. And all of these things will allow that horse downstream to be sold or rehomed really easily. So there are definitely, horses in this country and other parts of the world that, fall into rough circumstances. And maybe it's by no fault of their own. Maybe it's that they were in a great home for a number of years and something has changed with that family's financial status. And now they're in a position where they can't afford, the costly upkeep of having a horse on their property or having a horse boarded somewhere. And that's all understandable. Circumstances change. Okay, but the more sound, sane, and well cared for that animal, and the more useful he is to someone else, the easier it's going to be to sell that horse to another great owner, or rehome him and make sure that he ends up in a situation that's really good and where somebody else is going to care for him well for the next, however many number of years it takes until he gets kind of down the road. So really important. I think this is super critical. I'm not a huge fan of, again, people getting into horse ownership lightly for this reason. And they take a lot of money and they take a lot of upkeep and they take a lot of maintenance and care to make sure that they do, they are good citizens and they are useful. And the useful ones really end up being easily rehomed. It's the ones that tend not to be that I think it's easier for them to fall on really hard times. So I just think it's a responsibility as a horse owner that if you're going to take this on, you do a really good job of making sure that that horse is just such a good citizen that somebody else would be thrilled to have them. Okay, and then one of the other things that I think is important to touch on is just end of life decisions for these horses. So again, I've got a picture here of kind of an older horse. Definitely these are discussions that you need to be having with your veterinarian and making sure that, when the time comes that you're committed to providing that horse with a humane euthanasia, when the time is right. So humane euthanasia by definition is a good death. There are a number of ways that we can provide a horse with a really humane euthanasia, and your veterinarian would be someone that you would want to have those discussions with ahead of time so that you can kind of plan for it. The other thing that I think sometimes becomes a sticking point, especially if you're managing horses on really small acreage, is what is your plan for carcass disposal? So there's definitely areas of the country where you have restrictions on whether or not you could bury on property, whether that horse would need to be hauled off and disposed of in some other way. And so you want to make sure that you know what those legalities are and what your plan is, and have the equipment or have the contacts ready to be able to help you with that process when the time comes. So, you know, we never want to be euthanizing anything in an emergency. That's always, you know, our obviously worst case scenario, but planning ahead as much as possible, I think, is pretty critical. And then again, just, you know, having the emotional maturity to make a good decision for your horse. It's not always easy for us, but trying to be pretty objective about that and making sure that, you know, you're providing that horse with a good death when the time comes, and trying to limit or eliminate suffering. So I think all of those things are kind of critical to think about. Okay, any questions about that stuff before I get into costs and the money of the matter? All right, if there's nothing, let's talk a little bit about costs. So one of the things that I think is important to point out is that whatever you purchase that horse for, or you pay for that horse in an adoption fee, whatever it is that you outlay up front, I guarantee you that'll be the least amount of money that you spend on that horse throughout the rest of its life. And that is the same whether, you know, you get the horse for free, whether you pay $5,000 for it, $10,000 for it, or $100,000 for it. Whatever the upfront initial cost is of that horse, you will pay that much and more to upkeep it. So it's definitely, you know, not just the upfront cost of purchase, but it's all of those annual maintenance costs that tend to add up. And I tried to break those down for you a little bit, and I'm just giving you bare minimums here. But I can tell you how I arrived to some of these figures as well. So I think at a minimum, you would plan to spend about $2,500 on shelter. So shelter, again, you know, it could be something really low key. It could be a couple acres of pasture, maybe a little dry lot section, and a run-in shed. And you might be able to, you know, construct that, build that, put up some fence in an economic way for around $2,500. The sky is the limit on how the costs go up from there, depending on how intensive you would want your facility to be. So bare minimum, I would say $2,500. Okay, food and water, bare minimum, I would estimate a little over $2,000. So that's based on a horse's requirement of needing about 25 pounds per day of forage. So an average 1,000-pound horse will consume or require somewhere between 1.5 to 3.5% body weight per day in feed. Okay, so that would be a combination of forages and concentrates maybe. We try to make up the bulk of that diet in forages. So probably an average 1,000-pound horse in my barn is eating somewhere around 25 pounds of forage per day and maybe 3 pounds of concentrate per day. And again, that's at a minimum. That would be a horse that's like a pretty easy keeper, on a ration balancer, concentrate of some sort, doesn't have very high nutrient demands. So just basics, easy keeping horse, figure $2,100. Preventative care, again, is another annual expense. That would be at a minimum, I would say $500 and up. So you'll have a little bit in your annual exam and your farm call. You'll have, you know, a little bit in your Coggins tests, a little more in your vaccinations, a little bit more in maybe running some fecals, and your dentistry. So all of those things that I encapsulated as preventative care, figure about $500 a year. Emergency care, I would budget about $250. So again, depending on the size and the scope of the emergency, the sky's the limit. And another thing I think that's important to note here while we're talking about the cost of emergency care is you definitely need to have some budgetary constraints in your mind about what you would be willing to spend. So you can insure horses. So there's definitely a lot of like higher valued horses that are insured against loss of use, major medical, mortality, things like that. And we even have some horses at WVU that are insured because they're young and they're of value and they're super important to our program. So we decide to carry insurance on those horses for that reason, because it would be hard to replace them. So you can absolutely carry insurance on horses. It tends to only be economical when that horse has a pretty significant value associated with him. But I think it's at least important for you to have a figure in your mind of what you could spend if something really devastating came along. So if that horse needed to go to surgery, you know, you need to make some relative decisions about, again, what's the long-term prognosis of that horse coming out of surgery? You know, if it's great and they could go on to live many, many more years, then you may consider doing the investment of that surgery cost. If the prognosis is not great post-surgery, the horse is already super old, and it's definitely a welfare issue for that horse to be left untreated, you might decide to euthanize. So there's definitely decisions to make related to emergency care, but I think having a number in your head of what you're comfortable spending, you know, up to a certain limit is pretty critical. Farrier care, this is based just on a 6-week trim cycle. So this is a horse that's unshod, can happily go barefoot and do his job. I would say a basic cost is about $360 a year. So I wouldn't expect to pay less than $40 for a trim. So $40 for a trim every 6 weeks. Use and marketability, again, if you're really skilled, maybe that value is zero. Maybe it's just your time and labor. But if you're not, if you're more of a novice horse owner and you need to take lessons or send this horse out for training or go to clinics and do other things to make sure that that horse is good, useful, well-mannered, and marketable, you know, the sky's the limit again. End of life decisions, I would budget about $250 for at a bare minimum. And I didn't include all of the other accessory things. So this doesn't account for like hardware and supplies for your shelter. It doesn't includes everyday supplies like fly spray, fly masks, things that you might need. Doesn't include tack and equipment, doesn't include a truck and a trailer, doesn't include use fees. So like if you are going to take this horse to a clinic, how much does it cost? Or if you're going to take him to a horse show, how much would you pay to enter? So all of those things would just be added up on top of this. So I think at a bare minimum, you would have, you know, close to $6,000 in startup costs. And this is assuming you've paid nothing for the animal. And then at an annual minimum, I would expect another $3,200 and change as just kind of a basic cost of maintaining that horse. And that's pretty close. I'm really tuned in to what the cost is of our horses that are part of our teaching program here. And I would say that's a pretty fair number on kind of the annual cost of maintenance. So again, quite a bit can go into that, and these numbers can kind of skyrocket depending on what you're using these horses for, what kind of health statuses they have and things like that. But I think that's a good place to start. Other resources that I would point you to. So if you're just interested in learning more about horses or you have specific questions about horses, Extension does a really good job of pulling together horse experts from across the country that work in a platform called eXtension Horses. So the website is horses.extension.org. There's all kinds of online web resources there, online modules, classes, there's webinars that are posted. So it's just a really good platform that has really reputable information on horses. So it's horse industry professionals like myself, faculty at universities, extension horse specialists in other states, and we kind of all come together and collaborate on those resources. So I think that's a great resource for you. WVU Extension is definitely a great resource on like land management and planning. So if you were getting ready to prep your acreage to have a horse or two on, they could be a good resource on soil testing and developing a pasture management plan and figuring out your stocking rates and how you're going to utilize your forage and things like that. So an ag agent would be a really good resource for that kind of thing. And then the Department of Ag in West Virginia does have a horse ownership handbook as well that's available online, and that has some kind of basic information on some of the things that I talked about today, like basic shelter and care. Again, none of these resources are going to go into a ton of detail because the specifics about horse care are so specific to that individual horse. So we're pretty cautious about not making wild generalities about how those horses should be fed and cared for. But those are really good places to kind of get you started. Okay, so with that, I will be happy to answer any questions you have or circle back to any information. They can be general horse questions. They can be pretty specific horse questions. Happy to help you guys. I'm going to quit screen sharing, Ash, I think.
Yeah, I think you're the spotlight.
Okay, my screen share should be off. Are you guys good? Or do I need to exit Spotlight?
No, good.
Okay.
That's some feedback, though. I don't know if on your end or. Well, okay, so I do have a question from Lacey. So she said, from a business development perspective, we always encourage ag businesses to think about profitability and bottom line. Having said that, can you speak a bit more about marketability for horses on the farm, like trail riding, plowing, compost manufacturer? And she said, what's the most profitable way to diversify and ensure that a horse is an asset and not a liability?
Lacey, that is a loaded question. So, by and large, they will be a liability. They carry huge costs of maintenance, and horses are definitely a great example of how variable costs can kind of ramp up with your operation, right? So the more you use them, the more maintenance they require, the bigger costs that you're going to incur. So then it becomes a balance of, you know, what is the output that this animal is providing to this operation? So it's so individualized, like it would literally have to be a business by business decision. So there are definitely businesses that use horses for kind of niche purposes, like, you know, they log with a team of horses, or they work their fields with a team of horses, and maybe they have a CSA. And the horse is not only kind of a vehicle for the work, but they also kind of become part of the marketing strategy of the business. Do they pay for themselves on their own, like just by the work that they produce? Probably not, but can you embed it into the business and ensure that it's profitable? Yeah, you can probably cover your costs on some of that stuff. Definitely the businesses that are going to make the most money with horses are going to be like super high-end horse facilities. So the more valuable the horse is, that is part of the business, the more money that's going to produce, right? So probably the biggest financial gains in the horse industry, where you see the biggest profit margins, would be like in a really elite segment of the thoroughbred horse industry. And I'm talking super elite segments. So like very high dollar horses producing very high dollar stud fees, producing very high dollar offspring that then go hopefully win at the track. It's very difficult to make money and have a huge profit margin even on a more moderate level of like a competition or a performance horse. So there's definitely ways to make it work. I think there is an economy of scale that kind of comes into it. Like the trainers that are making the most money have a high volume of clients with high dollar horses. So from a homesteading perspective, I think you could definitely, you know, have the horse be part of kind of the marketing program for the business. But again, there's definitely going to be costs associated with upkeep. So, you know, whether or not it cash flows is a big loaded question. And how you keep them and what sort of land resources you have available to you is also kind of loads that question. So that was a really bad answer. I can't really give you a straight like, oh yeah, they'll make money, or oh no, they won't, because there's so many factors that feed into it. And you can definitely lose money fast not knowing what you're doing. So not to be entered into lightly.
Thanks, Crystal.
No, that was great. Yeah, I appreciate it. I more so wanted people to start thinking about the different opportunities that a horse could be a part of on the farm. So I think you definitely explained some of those. So
yeah, definitely, I think like from the ways that I've seen them used in more of a homesteading situation successfully, I would say would be like logging, you know, as workhorses in the field, or as part of kind of the marketing behind the CSA. So not only do you come out and you pick up your produce, you know, but you get to meet a draft horse, or you get to meet a miniature horse, or you get to whatever. And I think if you can kind of utilize them in a multitude of ways and also appeal to like just the love that people have of horses, then it might be a way to incorporate them in kind of a homesteading type situation.
Okay. Is there any resources that you recommend for buying / selling trading horses in West Virginia that are reputable?
No. Simply no. So there's no one good like clearinghouse. So there's it's definitely not, you know, like even like it's not even like going to buy hay, right? Where there's people that broker hay, there's hay sales, and then there's individual farmers. Selection and kind of finding a horse to purchase really comes down to word of mouth. So a lot of people will market horses online now. So there's a lot of Facebook groups that are dedicated to selling certain or advertising certain types of horses that are available, you know, for maybe sale or lease or lessons or whatever. So there's definitely Facebook groups that tend to be sort of discipline specific or breed specific for those horses. That's definitely one way that people market a lot of horses. The process is really arduous, right? Because you kind of are digging through all of these sales ads and then you know, trying to decide whether or not these people have posted quality videos of what this horse can do, and then trying to make decisions about whether or not you go actually preview this horse in person. So it can be kind of long and arduous, and there's no just like easy place to go buy horses without doing just a ton of legwork. So probably your best bet is working with somebody reputable that is, you know, a trainer or a competitor, if that's what you're trying to do, or utilizes horses on the trails, you know, really well, or raises horses that are going to work on an active farm, developing relationships with reputable people. And then if they don't have something available, they usually have a conduit of people that they know where to find something and can help you find something. So I think probably the best bet is find a person that's reputable, and then through that person, just through word of mouth is usually how you find something that's really good and really suitable. It's very hard to just go to a horse sale and assess what that horse is really going to be like. So even at a sale or an auction, you know, you can show up and you can see that horse on that day, but you don't have time to really look at that horse. You don't have time to ride that horse. You don't have time to handle that horse. You certainly don't have time to do a pre-purchase examination, which is what we would do if we were purchasing a horse for our program, as we would have a veterinarian do a full pre-purchase examination where they look at that horse from head to toe, take radiographs if we need radiographs of that horse, if it's going to be a performance horse, and do like a real thorough pick through of what that horse is. So auctions can just be really difficult because you're trying to make like a split-second assessment of what that animal is. And sometimes what you saw that day at the auction is not what ends up coming home with you. Or there's things that just, you know, present themselves once that horse gets home and settled in a different environment. So definitely working with a reputable person, definitely being able to lay hands on that horse and try that horse in person. 100% recommending doing a pre-purchase examination, whether you're spending $500 on that animal or $50,000 on it. And then if they allow a trial period can also be super helpful, because you can get that horse home for like 30 days, get it in your environment where you're handling it, and see if it's everything that you expected it to be. It's really hard to convince people to do trials, again, if they don't know you. So those are things where if you have that personal relationship, it's a little bit easier to work those details out. But yeah, there's no one good, easy place.
Okay, so what does the pre-purchase exam, what all does that include, and costs of that?
Okay, so that's a great question. So a pre-purchase exam is can be as basic or as thorough as you want it to be, and usually it's based on what that horse's intended use is. So a pre-purchase exam is usually instituted by the buyer. So if I was going to buy a horse for our program and I decided that I liked this horse, I thought he was going to work, I thought we could come to terms on price, then I would select a veterinarian, hire my own veterinarian to do a pre-purchase exam on that horse. So it's something that the buyer lines up and pays for. That veterinarian now becomes my veterinarian. So even if it's not who I normally use, I could be buying a horse in Ohio, and I would pick a vet clinic in Ohio that I thought was really reputable, and I would hire them to come in and pre-purchase this horse for me. They would do a routine physical exam. So they would do like everything that we talked about in an annual exam on that horse. They would make some assessments about like his vaccination profile. You know, does he have what he needs to come to my location and be utilized in the way that I'm going to use him? And then we would do a full lameness workup on that horse. So we'd watch him move at all 3 gaits. We might decide to flex limbs. So if there's something that doesn't look off, we can do a flexion test on that horse. We can do radiographs, ultrasounds, different diagnostics to kind of dig deeper and see if everything's normal or if there's something abnormal. And then it becomes a real discussion about what comes up in that pre-purchase. So a pre-purchase exam isn't like a pass-fail situation. So there will be things that will come up on a pre-purchase exam that will be, you know, no big deal, or there might be things that are performance limiting for me. So things that are non-starters, as soon as that comes up on pre-purchase, I'm going to kill the sale. So that's where you having those discussions with that veterinarian comes into play. Them understanding what you plan to use that horse for comes into play. So I literally have done pre-purchase exams on horses where we've pulled the horse out of the stall, trotted it down a firm surface. There was clearly an unsoundness, and I've killed the pre-purchase exam at this point and decided to go no further. There's been other pre-purchase exams where everything's been normal, and then maybe you find something really minor on a radiograph that's no big deal to you. So maybe some mild arthritis or something, no big deal for the age and the use of the intended horse. So, you know, you can kind of let the pre-purchase roll. You can go as intensive with it as you want. You can spend as much money as you want taking all of the films and doing all of the diagnostics, or you can, you know, decide that all you want is a regular annual exam on that horse. And if he, you know, seems healthy and he can walk, trot, canter at all 3 gaits and he seems fine, that's it. That's all you're interested in pursuing, because the demands on that horse aren't going to be that great. So pre-purchases, super important. They will, for me, they'll make or break a sale. So there's things that are like non-starters for me that I'm not willing to maintain. And then there's things that, you know, are probably going to be no big deal for that horse. And so I'd be happy to buy him, even if something like that shows up on pre-purchase. An average pre-purchase exam, I would say like a very low end exam is probably $500. If you're taking radiographs of that horse, so if we're taking x-rays of all of his joints and his limbs, probably $1,000. And then if you're doing more, on up from there.
Cool. Thanks, Crystal.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else have any other questions? If not, we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
The other thing I didn't mention when we were talking about sales, like somebody asked if there was one good clearinghouse to like buy a horse. And again, there's really not. Like, you've got to do just a ton of due diligence on your own part to find something. There definitely are people that adopt horses or rescue horses to like adopt and rehome out. And I think the same goes for that. So there's definitely like super reputable places that do a really good job with that process and take really good care to kind of vet those horses and really know what the needs of those horses are, what their personalities are, if they have any performance restrictions, things like that. And they do a really good job of disclosing all of that to a potential adoptee. And then there's also places that don't. So again, whether you're buying for money, adopting for a fee, or even being given a horse for free, I just think it's definitely, the onus is on you to really do your due diligence and kind of dig and make sure that the animal is what you intended it to be.
Okay. Is there anything else that anyone wants to ask or add? Okay, well, thanks, Crystal.
Not a problem. Thank you guys for logging on. And if you have any questions afterwards, or you just get thinking about stuff more, you're welcome to email me. My email is just crystal.smith@mail.wvu.edu.
I'll put that in the chat too.
Okay, yeah, definitely throw it in the chat. Ashley, you guys are welcome to email me at any time. I teach quite a bit, so I'm oftentimes not in my office, or I'm away from my phone because I teach a lot of hands-on courses at WVU. So definitely email is the best way to reach me.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Have a good night.
Thanks, Crystal.
Yeah.